Last Monday night, two undefeated college football teams met to determine who would be the champion of this past season. And there was no way that anyone could have predicted the outcome. As I said, both teams were undefeated. Both teams had, each team had just as good a chance as the other. And no one really knew who would pull out the victory. But since the Alabama Crimson Tide beat the Ohio State Buckeyes last Monday night, for the most part, the Buckeyes I know have been very good sports, but of course most of the Buckeyes I know are Christians. I have heard since that not all Buckeyes have been good sports about this, but the ones that I'm hearing from have just been, they've just been relieved to have even had a season and to make it to the championship. That's just icing on the cake. But sometimes you just have to accept defeat, and it's something that we should learn from the time that we were children playing sports or even board games. We need to learn to accept loss and not throw a temper tantrum every time and not try to do something like just turn the board over and scatter the pieces everywhere. And if we learn to accept losses, we will be much better adjusted adults. But we have to learn how to lose. We cannot cheat, we cannot throw tantrums, and endeavors like high school sports can teach you things like that, like how to lose graciously. We must realize that you can't win them all, and if you resort to cheating or winning on some disputed technicality, then have you really won? See, we want to win the right way. We want to give it our all, and then if we suffer loss, then so be it. We will strive to do better next time. But there are times we'll lose thinking that maybe we weren't treated fairly. And we'll suspect that maybe the other team cheated or maybe the coaches didn't put in the right people. Maybe the refs made bad calls. So what happens when the buzzer sounds and the winner is announced? If we feel that we were treated unfairly, do we rush the field and start beating up other players and coaches and refs? Or do we graciously concede defeat and go and shake hands or what have you with the opposing team? Do we graciously greet our opponents or do we fight it tooth and nail? Guitar virtuoso George Thorogood and his band The Destroyers have made a career of making new arrangements of old blues classics. One of their biggest hits was called Bad to the Bone, which you may remember. And one of my favorite songs by Thorogood is called You Got to Lose. Now, he arranged it. He didn't write it. It was written by Earl Hooker way back in the day. But the chorus, although not the most intelligent lyrics in the world, they read as follows: You got to lose. You can't win all the time. You got to lose. You can't win all the time. Well, I know, pretty baby. I see trouble coming down the line. And that is how it is when you don't know how to lose. There's going to be trouble down the line. And in one part of the song, Thorogood sings that he was down on the street, but now he's back on his feet. And so even when you experience loss, there's the potential for comeback. Now, speaking of winners and losers, and Thorogood, by the way, is from Wilmington, Delaware, which is where President-elect Joe Biden is from. And in politics especially, it seems that no one ever wants to admit defeat. Nobody wants to concede an election, especially a very close election. And understand that I'm not making any judgment calls here, not telling you whose side you should be on. But over the last 30 years, I've seen a number of times when the losing party was either reluctant or unwilling to concede. And we've seen this in presidential races where the losing candidate blames everyone and everything but oneself for their loss. We've heard allegations of cheating, fraud, foreign collusion, and voting irregularities. We've seen the opposite parties, in both cases, try to remove a duly elected president from office because they didn't agree with his agenda. And objectivity forces me to say that I've seen that from both major parties. But at the end of the day, legal declarations are made, and for the peace of the nation, defeat must finally be accepted. And yes, the stakes are higher than with sports, but if violence is to be avoided, there comes a time to accept defeat, whether one thinks that it was fair or not. One Old Testament figure who is notable for having refused to accept defeat is King Saul. He had become proud, selfish, and drunk with power. In 1 Samuel 15:12, Saul had set up a monument to his own honor because he was that narcissistic. Only a narcissist would do that. Back in chapter 13, he had taken on the role of a priest, offering a burnt offering in order to manipulate God and religion to his own agenda. Then in chapter 15, he refuses to wipe out the Amalekites as God had told him to do. Saul was a real piece of work, and the Lord declared that he would lose his throne and his dynasty. The Lord was raising up another to take Saul's place, and Saul knew that, but he refused to accept it. But he kept on resisting the inevitable. He refused to concede the loss of his kingdom. Now understand that any resemblance in this sermon to persons living or dead is purely coincidental. And I'm not suggesting exact parallels. In those days, though, the buck stopped with God, who made his wishes known through the prophets. We do not have that clear of vision. We don't even know if God has a particular side. But his intent to make David king was plainly disclosed. Saul would not accept it. But you see a stark contrast between how Saul dealt with things and how David dealt with things. Saul destroyed his own power and influence, and he had no one to blame but himself. He was jealous, delusional, prideful, and violent. He wanted David dead. And he was obsessed with holding on to what he knew was slipping away from him, but he did not know how to lose. Maybe no one ever taught him that. David, on the other hand, was a man after God's own heart. He loved God. He loved his country. He was humble, and his posture before God was that of humility. He depended upon God for everything. He turned to God and inquired of him whenever there was a decision of consequence. As 1 Samuel 23 opens, David has been on the run from Saul and has been hiding out in caves and in the upper elevation of the cliffs, and Saul has been relentlessly trying to take his life. Saul pursues him relentlessly, but David won't even allow this to distract him from serving his country. David gets word that the Philistines have been raiding the town of Keilah. And the town of Keilah, it's harvest season right now. They have the grain out, and the Philistines are trying to steal their grain, which was out on the threshing floors. Now, the threshing floors were flat pieces of land on the tops of hills in Israel, and all the grain during harvest would be spread out on the top of the hill. One would take a pitchfork and toss the wheat up into the air, and the wheat would be separated from the chaff. But now the grain is all lying out on the threshing floors prior to its processing. And this grain has been planted and watered and nurtured and harvested by the Israelites. But the Philistines say, hey, let's go and take it. Let's go take something that isn't ours. And in doing so, they're going to destroy the people's economy. They're going to take all their food away from them because people sometimes want something for nothing. And when David hears about this, he wants to help. And while it seems undoubtedly the right thing to do, David doesn't proceed until he goes to God in prayer. In verse 2, he inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? The Lord answered him, go attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But while David has the go-ahead from God, his men still aren't convinced. They are still afraid to go against the Philistines until David goes back and inquires of the Lord a second time to learn that God will indeed give them the victory. And so these men are emboldened by the assurance of victory from God's word. Now, there aren't many endeavors in this life in which we have the absolute assurance of victory. I mentioned the football game, of which no one knew the outcome. Now, some might have thought that they knew the outcome. Some may have thought it so much that they bet on it. And hopefully no one bet on the presidential election, but no one really knew that Alabama would win. And no one knows who will win an election in spite of the polls that take place, and no one knows who's going to win a war, no matter how obvious it might seem. But imagine knowing that you have the victory. I know of a man who for years would videotape football games off TV because he was rarely home to watch them. Had a very busy career, and when he got time to watch them, he hadn't been careful about hearing the final score of the game or who won. And so he entertained all the spoilers, and then he went home and he watched the game. And friends who watched it with him who did not know the ending were wondering why he could smile even while his team was down 14 points. And he says, because I know the ending. I know who wins. And that's how it is with us as the people of God. We will not and cannot be ultimately defeated. The Word of God has assured our victory. And as you read a book like Revelation, for example, there are some scary times that have come, that are coming for God's people, but at the same time, the victory is assured. But if you read it at all, then you know what happens in the end. We win. Now, it might seem at times that we have lost ground to our opponents, that we have been set back by, we've been penalized and lost some yards. We fumbled a few times, and friends have been taken off the field because of their absolute refusal to play by the rules. But despite all this, we still win. We are not going to lose this battle against evil. God knows what He's doing, and He is the one who, according to Daniel 2:32, is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone He wishes. Whoever happens to be in power at a given time does not erase the coming victory. Those in power cannot thwart the plans of God, and He'll even use the powerful to advance His kingdom. And you'll wonder, what is God doing? But He is definitely at work. And the battle that we fight, it's not a battle against human beings. It's not a battle against flesh and blood. As we're told in Ephesians 6:12, it is a battle against the dark forces of the spiritual realm. And we do not fight with the weapons of this world, according to 2 Corinthians 10:4. We do not fight with swords and guns and tanks and drones. We do not use the enemy's own weapons against him. But we rely upon prayer and the Word and peace and righteousness. And these will do more to overcome the powers of evil than any militant or political action. So if we're going to be obsessed with anything, maybe we should be obsessed with the gospel. Because the biggest battle, the most important battle that we can fight is the battle against ignorance of the gospel. Now, David certainly did some fighting, and he did some literal fighting in holy wars that were endorsed by God. David was not by nature a violent man, but the fight often came to him. He didn't go out picking fights, but the fights came to him. And rarely, if ever, do we have that kind of clarity or assurance that a war has God's endorsement. But God had given it to David so that he could fight for his country, and he was not by nature violent, but Saul, on the other hand, he was a violent man. Like I said, he wanted David dead. He wanted to eliminate the competition. And when he heard of David coming to defend Keilah, Saul thought, this is my chance. Here's David, holed up in a walled city with a gate with bars. He's trapped. I can go. And Saul even deludes himself into thinking that God has handed David over to him in verse 7. And so David learns that Saul is coming to get him. So what does he do in verse 9? But he calls for the ephod. David will once more inquire of the Lord, as in most consequential situations. The ephod was kind of like a pullover apron with a front and a back, attached to shoulder pads, and with a gold breastplate on the chest. And it was worn by the high priest, and the names of 6 Israelite tribes were inscribed on each of the shoulder pads, 6 on one, 6 on the other. And then on the breastplate, there were 12 precious stones representing each of the 12 tribes of Israel. The ephod was apparently an avenue through which a king or a priest could inquire of God. It was not an idol, since it was not representing God himself, but we have no such commands to use any such objects under the New Covenant. It was only prescribed for the Levitical priests and for use by the kings. And one such priest, Abiathar, had brought the ephod with him. He had escaped the massacre of the priests by Saul, and now he was in league with David. So David now has the religious establishment on his side. And with Saul mounting an offense, David asks that the ephod be brought to him by Abiathar. David is likely safe if the people of Keilah will protect him. So he inquires of the Lord, only to hear in verse 12 that the people of Keilah will hand David over to Saul. Now, isn't that just something? After all that David had done for these people, he has come, he has defended them against their enemies, he has spared their lives, he has saved their city, he has saved their economy, and yet they're willing to hand him over to Saul. Is this how they repay him? And so David and his 600 men have to flee, according to verse 13. David now stays in the wilderness strongholds of the hills of the desert of Ziph. Now, day after day, Saul reluctantly searches for him, but verse 14 says that God did not give David into his hands. If David escapes, despite Saul's many resources and his limitless army, it will only be because God has allowed it, because God won't hand David over to Saul. God has plans for David. And here we see the sovereignty of God strongly affirmed. He is involved in the world's affairs, even when we don't see it, and even when it doesn't seem like it. And David depends upon God's word and inquires of him in prayer. And God comes through for David. Does God also come through for you? Do you trust him? Is your life guided by his word? Do you look to him for instruction on how to live? Do you seek God's guidance in prayer? Do you inquire of him before every major decision? And I'm not sure that we're always so good at separating the major decisions from the minor ones. I know of a family who once prayed that they would adopt the right dog. And when you think about it, that may seem like a small thing, but really when you select a family pet, you're probably going to keep that pet for 10 years or more. And you want to select a pet that whose disposition, you can live with, who will be good with the kids, a pet that will not turn on you, a pet that is teachable. And so maybe that isn't something too small to pray about after all. Maybe there aren't things that are too small to pray about if they're important to you. And lest we forget, we should always be in prayer about our relationships. As this story illustrates, not everyone can be trusted. If you try to trust in people, if you put your trust in people, whether it be a romantic interest, a church leader, an employee, or a politician, there is always the possibility that that person or those people can let you down. People are not infallible. And even when people are well-meaning, they can hurt you with their good intentions. And if you look to them for all your answers, then in some area or another, eventually they're going to point you in the wrong direction. Now, that is not to say that we should be cynically suspicious of absolutely everyone, but don't look to people for your ultimate answers. Look to God. Look to his word. Stay close to him in prayer. Are you guided by his word? Do you look to him in prayer? Do you trust in his providence? David wasn't handed over to Saul because God didn't allow it. Do you believe that God's hand moves in your life, especially in response to prayer? Is God concerned? Does God intervene in our lives? And I am convinced, I am persuaded beyond the shadow of any doubt that he does. God cares about each of our individual lives. He orchestrates things, though he may not micromanage them. But if your goal is to please him, he will grant you that ability. So we need the word, we need prayer, we need God's providence. But another thing we need is other people. And David had a very close spiritual friend in Jonathan. While Saul looked high and low trying to find David, he did not know where to look, but Jonathan, knowing the heart and mind of David, knew just where to find him. And he comes to him in the Rocky Mountains of Horesh. And in verse 16 it says that Jonathan went to David and helped him find strength in God. Verse 17, "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king of Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." Again, Saul knows about his kingdom's demise. He knows that David will replace him, but he just keeps on trying to delay the inevitable. And Saul's own son Jonathan has much to lose if David becomes king, because he'll no longer be a royal heir. But he is happy just to be David's number two, just to be his armor bearer, just to be his captain of the guard. because Jonathan loved David more than his own self-interest. And Jonathan doesn't have to be first. Of course, and when this conversation took place, neither Jonathan nor David knew about Jonathan's coming untimely death. They do not know that this is the last time they'll be visiting. But Jonathan is David's support. He gives him the strength he needs by encouraging him in the Lord. And if we are to stay on the path to victory, we need other people too. We need other people to encourage us. We need Christian friends, because we are social creatures and we can hardly stick to anything without human interaction, without human encouragement. And so in addition to the word, prayer, and providence, we also need other people. And that is where the fellowship of the church and our gatherings come in. Not only gatherings for worship, but also fellowship events, which in our congregation we will get back to eventually once this COVID thing is over. But when Jonathan heads home, another group of people try to sell David out. They are the Ziphites, in whose territory David has been hiding, and they tell Saul where to find him. Since Saul is still king and not everyone is aware of God's plan for David, people who aren't loyal to him think that they're simply being patriotic. They think that to help David would be committing treason, and so their loyalty is still with Saul. Saul orders reconnaissance on David. Where have you seen him last? What are his typical movements? Saul and his army are finally closing in, and with Saul and his army on one side of a craggy mountain, David and his on the other side, Saul's people are about to close in on him, when finally a messenger comes and interrupts and informs Saul that the Philistines are again attacking somewhere in Israel. There's another raiding party, and so Saul has to go away from David because he's distracted by the Philistines. Now that's ironic that at first Saul thought that the Philistines had helped him to trap David, and now it's the Philistines who lead him away from David. But David never resorted to a coup. He never raised his hand in violence against Saul. He never incited violence against Saul's reign. And he was happy to refer to Saul as the Lord's anointed for as long as he was on the throne. So being a man of God, David did not take matters into his own hands, but he waited for God's plan. And we as Christians, we should be able to do the same. We're not to plot against the government. We're not to incite violence. But we're to wait on the Lord's plan, knowing that ultimately we are on the side of victory. And King Jesus, Son of David, will prevail.